Part 1: First love. I'd met the woman who I thought was my one true love back in high school when I was in the 10th grade. Her name was Carol Manning, and believe me, she was absolutely incredible, with her long blonde hair and gorgeous blue eyes. She was really popular with everyone in our class. We were both the same age. Every guy was crazy about her. As for me, my name is Brad Wernicke. I was kind of skinny and tall, a bit awkward. She didn't really notice me. I couldn't blame her. I was shy, not very good with girls, not particularly athletic, and didn't have any special talents in art or music. The first time I saw her was at her 16th birthday party. She had a boyfriend at the time named Vernon Smithers, who was a high school dropout 2 years older than her. He was a real jerk, always working on cars and looking tough. If anyone dared to glance at him, he would growl and say, "What are you looking at?" I couldn't stand him. So at her party, she was wearing this cute corduroy dress with suspenders, knee-high socks, and low-heeled shoes that made her legs look great. Her hair was flowing and she was smiling at everyone. She looked like a goddess. She spotted me from across the room. I wasn't even invited to the party, but I had come with another guy who knew her. She looked right at me, smiled, and made her way through the crowd to stand in front of me. She gently touched the back of my neck with her hands, and the touch sent shivers down my spine. Then she leaned in and gave me a sweet hug. After that, she giggled, gently pinched my cheek, and walked back to her boyfriend without saying a word. He gave me a threatening look, but I didn't care. I had fallen hopelessly in love, and I had to make her mine. Slowly but surely, I managed to outshine all the other guys who were interested in her. By the time we graduated high school, it was just her and me. And it definitely helped that her parents made her stop seeing Vernon. On the day of graduation, we received our diplomas and decided to go to the beach. We were finally old enough, and we were determined to take our relationship to the next level. Afterwards, we would sit side by side and talk about our future. September came, and it was time for college. I wanted to become a math teacher, and Carol wanted to pursue a nursing career. I attended a local college, while she stayed in a dorm at a big hospital downtown. Over the next 4 years, we faced our fair share of challenges. Alongside my classes, I had to work to support myself. Plus, with Carol being almost 20 miles away, we didn't get to see each other as often as we wanted. During that time, I faced some personal struggles at home. My dad had a major health crisis, suffering a brain hemorrhage while at work. He had to undergo a risky procedure to remove some of his brain tissue. This left him disabled, and my family struggled financially. My mom had to get a job, and I had to help take care of my younger brother and sister. My brother started getting into trouble, missing school, and getting bad grades. He even ended up at the police station once. My sister, like Carol, faced her fair share of challenges. She attracted the attention of older guys because of her beauty, and keeping her away from them became quite a task. My dad could only observe everything, unable to do much. It broke my heart to see him in that state. He had been a strong role model for all of us, and his decline was painful for the entire family. As for Carol and me, we went through a couple of breakups but managed to work things out. Looking back, I realized that these brief separations were probably times when she was exploring other options. I, on the other hand, remained faithful and committed to her. Despite my insecurities, she was the only one I wanted. But I couldn't prove anything, and we weren't engaged until the spring of my senior year. Speaking of proof, there was a time when my suspicions got the best of me. We were going through a tough time, and I was certain she was being unfaithful. Whenever I called her, her nursing school friends would answer and make me feel guilty for not giving her space. They claimed she was at the dorm, crying and upset because of how I had treated her. I knew I had never been mean to her. Driven by my suspicions, I would drive down to the city to find out the truth. But I never achieved anything. Carol had her own car, kept in a private garage, so it was impossible for me to check if it was gone. The only thing I could do was wait outside the hospital or drive around aimlessly. I only drove myself crazy, but my love for her was so strong. It was a difficult time at home, with my dad in his chair, watching what was happening with my mom, while I was on my own quest for answers. Looking back, I think my dad had it worse. I finally graduated and got a job teaching high school math, and Carol got something at a pediatric clinic not far from where we grew up. We got married, had a nice wedding, and we were finally on our way. A few months in, and Carol got pregnant. Our first was a boy, so we named him after me. A couple years after that, a little girl showed up. We named her Bridget after Carol's mom. With 2 kids in the family, Carol decided, rather than get a procedure done, she'd go on medication. Me, not anxious to get a medical procedure, I went along. It never occurred to me back then her decision not to do a procedure might someday lead to trouble. Life went on, and it was good. We bought a small starter home in a quiet older neighborhood. Since we had her mom to help with the pregnancies or childcare, Carol never missed much time from work. Carol stayed at the clinic and got into supervision, while I got a couple promotions, eventually to principal, and transferred to a newer, larger high school. The whole time we were always close. By that I mean no long out-of-state meetings or seminars. Every now and then I'd be called away for a few days, and once or twice Carol got a chance to add to her education by staying overnight at one of the big hospitals in the city. What I mean was I was there and she was there, so there was never any of the old, "You're never around or we hardly see each other" excuses. Just the same trouble came. Long about the time our son was in the 6th grade, I guess I sort of knew something just wasn't quite right. What was it that sort of made me suspicious? I guess it was the little things I'd seen with my mom. Carol always liked nice things, but I thought maybe her clothes were a little more revealing, the blouses looked a little thin, and maybe the heels were a little higher. I never said anything. Another thing sort of bothered me. We'd always talked. We'd talk about the kids, about vacations, and about our long-term plans. Well, the kids, vacations, the bills, household needs were still on the table, but we stopped talking about the long term. I mean, Carol was still thinking about the near future, but anything a year or 2 years away just stopped getting any attention. Sounded silly, I guess, but we'd done some camping. We'd gone from a tent to a pop-up, and for a while we'd been investigating trailers. Carol had been talking about saving vacation and comp. Time for a long drive across the country. For a while she seemed excited, and then it just stopped. I would still bring up things like the Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, but she'd stop participating. I'd mention something, maybe ask her a couple questions, and she'd kind of stammer and dodge around it. She'd nervously agree, and then come back with a remark like, "Yes, but the thing of it is," or "Of course yes, but right now is not a good." When she talked like that, I noticed she'd never look at me. She wasn't looking ahead like I was. Maybe she had other plans. This was before the widespread use of affordable cell phones, GPS devices, or laptops, and the internet was still in its early stages, so modern notions of electronic surveillance were still just a little over the horizon, at least as far as I was concerned. There weren't going to be any private investigators either. For one, for me the idea of spying on my wife was unacceptable, and second, Carol managed the money. Does that raise any concerns? It should. Carol managed the money. We had a checking account, but I never used it. We had one credit card we both used, and besides, most things were still being done with cash. Oh, I used the card for gas and trips to the lumber yard, but food and other items were done with cash. Carol did the shopping, bought the kids' clothes, and handled the bills. Every now and then I'd ask, "Are we doing okay financially?" And Carol would always answer, "We're good." It wasn't the money, not at first, that raised red flags. I was a principal, and that meant things like PTA and sports. Fall meant Friday night football and after-school soccer and hockey. Winter was basketball and volleyball, and springtime meant baseball, lacrosse, and track. Of course, I couldn't get to every game, but I was expected to be around for most of them, and that did leave Carol home alone with just the kids every now and then. I had to rethink this a little. There were a few occasions when I had to be away. There were times for Carol too. For me, there were professional conferences and also educational boards. These two organizations were designed to make periodic visits to participating high schools. Being a principal, it meant me having to occasionally participate as a specialist, sometimes in administration, sometimes in mathematics, in visits to various schools. These visits could take as long as a whole week away from home. Carol, being a supervisor, also had to make occasional trips away from home. I never believed any of these trips turned into anything inappropriate. Maybe I was wrong. I'll never know. Still, Carol was home alone with the kids. Or was she? 2 doors down was Jenny McFertle, 16, and available to babysit. I suspect something started in the fall of our son's 6th grade year. Our daughter was in the 4th grade, and I had Friday night football. Carol was good about what she did. No cleverness was more the operative word. She had her colleagues, and I had my football. It was too easy. I might hang around school and stay for a game, or come home, grab a bite, change clothes, and take off. Sometimes, if the weather permitted, I'd even take the kids. Believe me, taking the kids to a football game was great for them. They got to hang out with older kids, and there was always a bunch of junior or senior girls more than willing to help out by playing with the kids. Either way, whether it was Jenny McFertile or high school girls, it was good for me, good for our kids, and good for Carol, just for her in another way. I didn't want to drag this out with my son, so I planned to lay things out as clearly as I could. I remember I found out there seemed to be two kinds of affairs. One was the sneaky little secret meeting, and the second the ill-famed exit affair. The downside in all this was it was possible for a secretive meeting to evolve or devolve into something worse. Here's what really stinks. I was essentially a school teacher. While Carol worked around doctors, it made a difference. Doctors, for the most part, are wonderful people. They help people. Teachers do too, but doctors save lives. There's clearly something that could complicate things. Both teachers and doctors are all pretty well educated, but doctors, as I've already said, deal in life and death, or at the very least sometimes serious medical concerns, and they're always looked upon with great respect. Teachers get a degree of respect too, but not like doctors. This difference can be disastrous, especially if someone's family is on the line. Backing up a bit, my dad had worked in a warehouse, and Carol's was a plumber. In short, we both came from working class backgrounds. Doctors in our families were held in high regard, very high regard. As a professional, I worked with kids. Carol's colleagues were doctors. I was impressed by the innocence of young minds. Carol was impressed by confident professionals who were seldom, if ever, wrong. Regrettably for me and my family, one of these impressive professionals just happened to be a doctor who specialized in the treatment of children's cancer. For sure, no math teacher turned principal, regardless of the complexity of the quadratic equation, could ever compete with the surgeon who saved the lives of little boys and girls suffering from ailments like leukemia. I never believed Carol was the sneaky type. I guess I was wrong. In fact, I was definitely and without a doubt wrong. I met Dr. Maynard Gilmore once. It was at one of Carol's work events. I liked him. I thought he was a friendly and trustworthy kind of man. He wasn't married, divorced I later heard, but that meant nothing at the time. After 12 years of marriage and 2 kids, I trusted my wife. I believed in her. I was a fool. It wasn't like I seriously suspected any kind of unfaithfulness, emotional or otherwise. I didn't look around for any signs. They were there. I did notice, but honestly, I never suspected a thing. It turned out to be Carol's stupidity, or more precisely her carelessness, that ruined everything. So I was busy with the football games, either with or without the kids, every Friday. Then came winter and it was basketball season. Carol had been acting strange, but something was going on. She got through football season without giving herself away, but basketball games were seldom on Fridays. There were a few Fridays, but most of the time they were late afternoon matches held on Thursdays. Along the way, I started to figure something out because Carol wasn't sticking to a reliable schedule. Carol kept her Fridays, but now she was often out on other nights. I was often home when she came back from her quick visits with her colleagues. I remember there was a student, a senior who had to retake his health class, which was scheduled for 2 days a week, Mondays and Wednesdays. Normally, it was a 3-day class. This student thought he could skip Mondays, and the teacher might think he only needed 1 hour. Well, the student started skipping Mondays. Then he got careless and started showing up on Mondays but skipping Wednesdays. The teacher got suspicious, checked the September records, and caught the student. He faced detention and had to take health for 3 days the rest of the year. Believe me, on the night when everything finally blew up, it wasn't the smell of alcohol on her breath. It wasn't her lack of interest in our future plans. It wasn't the rush to get past the kids and me when she came home from that night with her friends. It was her appearance. Carol had always been into fashion. She always had to have the latest styles, the nicest clothes. Her hair always had to be perfectly done, her nails always had to be on point, and her makeup always had to be just right. So why was she looking so disheveled that night? Why was her makeup smudged? Why was her hair a mess? And what were those stains on her skirt and blouse? At first, I ignored it. Honestly, I didn't notice or pretended not to notice at first, but soon enough I understood. Finally, I asked her, "Carol, what's been going on these late nights you come home?" She looked at me with a confused expression. I could tell she was drunk. She replied, "What do you mean?" I said, "Just look at yourself. What have you been doing? Where have you been? You look like you've been wrestling in the mud." She responded, "Just with some friends." Annoyed and impatient, I asked, "Seriously?" "Who?" she told me. She listed several names, including a couple of doctors, one of whom was Maynard Gilmore. I asked her, well, excuse me, Carol, but something doesn't seem right. What's going on? She was pretty drunk, not stumbling, but definitely not sober. Everyone knows alcohol affects a person's self-control. They become more uninhibited. She crossed the line. She stood there in our living room. The kids were asleep, and she said, "For goodness sake, Brad. You know? I know you know." I said, "No, Carol, I don't know," and I truly didn't. That's when she dropped the bomb, me and Dr. Gilmore. You know, I understood then. I felt like my world had just been shattered. I needed to hear more. "No, Carol." "What do you mean, you and Dr. Gilmore?" That's when she started to cry. She sat down and said, "I'm sorry, Brad. My initial reaction was that this couldn't be happening." But it was. It felt like out of a novel an hour ago, it had been the best of times, but not anymore. She sobbed a few times before saying, "Dr. Gilmore and I. Well, Brad, I'm sorry, we're in love." My world had come crashing down. I felt like my head had been chopped off. It's funny the thoughts that come to a person's mind at times like that. I once read that after being beheaded, a person remained somewhat conscious for about 7 seconds. Looking back, those were my 7 seconds. Imagine from life to something else in just 7 seconds. I had no idea what I was supposed to say or do. Something just washed over me, like a surge of electricity, overwhelming and brief, and then I went numb. I just knew. What had been us, the we, was over. I said, "You're leaving me." There, I said it, just like that. I said it, and I knew it was true. No build-up, no mystery, no nothing. 1 minute I was married, had a wife, had a family and a home, and the next. Nothing, an abyss. Looking back now, I know it was much worse. I was a complete wreck that night. I remember I didn't cry or beg or plead, but I remember how I felt, and it was terrible, awful, but not as awful as it was about to become. Carol sat there, hair undone, blouse wrinkled, breath terrible, with what were definitely stains on her skirt and blouse, and she said, "Yes, Brad, I guess I am." I remembered she tried the "let's show some sympathy" act. I had seen teachers do the same thing to students year after year. It was old news to me. She sat there, regained some composure, though still pretty intoxicated. She said, "Brad, I love you. I've always loved you. I'm just not in love with you anymore." That hit me hard. What a tired old line. Our marriage had become a cliché. I stopped being shocked and became incredibly angry. No, not just angry, furious. It was time to fight back. I remember looking around the room and the first thing I saw was her curio cabinet. I had to get rid of it. As I got up and headed towards her precious collection of trinkets, I shouted, "You horrible person." I reached the cabinet just in time. She knew what I had planned. She was a split second too late. I grabbed one of the side doors and yanked with all my might. It was a delicate antique, a family heirloom. The door came right off. With my hands inside, I started to destroy her precious moments figurines, her Waterford candlesticks, her Swarovski vase, her grandmother's knickknacks. They went flying everywhere. I smashed everything I could reach, and I did it with anger, extreme anger. Carol was screaming and crying, begging me to stop, but I had only just begun. It took just a few seconds to destroy the curio cabinet, and then I moved on to the television, the stereo, and the pictures. I smashed everything. I noticed the dining room wall cabinet with the fancy china, the husband and wife dolls under the plastic dome, the special gifts, the crystal wine glasses. I charged at them. She followed me. I pushed her away and destroyed everything. I even broke the picture of the happy bride and groom on our dining room wall. I tore it out and ripped it into pieces. I threw the shreds around like confetti. I shouted, "Hooray, it's over." Then I went to the kitchen and destroyed all the trinkets she had displayed there, her children's objects. I was no longer angry. I felt nothing. I didn't care. Everything had to go. I picked up one kitchen chair after another and smashed them against anything I could reach. I grabbed plates from the kitchen cupboard and threw them in every direction. I even broke the gooseneck faucet. She followed me, crying and begging. She didn't get it. Every little thing, every piece of furniture, every dish, every glass, they were all a part of her. I opened the refrigerator and let its contents spill out. The milk, the iced tea, the leftover chicken, the cream, everything scattered everywhere. I had turned into a maniac. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. Standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room were my 2 kids. They looked terrified. Bridget said something. I think she said, "Daddy." I collapsed onto the last unbroken kitchen chair and started crying, I cried like a young child. Carol hurried the kids back to bed and returned to the kitchen. I was still crying, but she wasn't. No, Carol didn't cry. Carol was in pure skank mode. She stood across from me and coldly said, "You should leave. Pack a bag and just go." I looked at her, then at the house and the destruction. She was right. I knew that if I stayed another minute, my kids would be without a mother and I would end up in jail. I went upstairs and packed a small bag. I was surprised at how composed I was. All the shock, denial, and tragedy had simply disappeared. I just needed to leave. I moved out, first to a motel room and then to a small apartment near our house. I was sad, of course. I was incredibly unhappy. But I was a man. I would get through this. My dad had endured much worse. I could do it because I was my father's son. As I thought about sharing these events with my son, I couldn't help but wonder how I managed to stay calm in the following days, even now, nearly 20 years later. My son shared with me how scared he and Bridget were on that night. He mentioned how Bridget cried for days, but I already knew all of that. Carol didn't waste any time. Her big confession happened on a Thursday night. She obtained a restraining order and hired a tough lawyer. I was served with divorce papers the following Friday. At least she didn't serve me at my workplace. I pondered how to explain to my son the difficult weeks that followed. I hired my own lawyer. While the atmosphere during the meeting with Carol and her lawyer was toxic, we managed to come to a fair settlement. First, the hostility. I still wanted to know why, but Carol didn't have an answer. She claimed she had fallen out of love with me and needed to move on. I asked her why she hadn't come to me earlier. Maybe if she had, we would have found a solution. I told her that she was the only woman I had ever been with, and I couldn't imagine myself being with anyone else. But then she hit me hard. I can't recall her exact words, but they haunted me for years. She said that I no longer met her needs. She had outgrown me. She told me I was boring and life with me had become monotonous. She said I was going nowhere and that she needed something better. She compared me to hamburger while she wanted filet mignon. She didn't hold back. She told me she couldn't believe that I was still inexperienced when we got together at the beach. She mentioned her new boyfriend, Vernon Smithers, and how he had already taken her, even while we were dating. It hurt to hear that. She said she only got involved with me because her parents made her break up with Vernon. She admitted that she liked me, but she never truly loved me. She claimed that I was just someone her parents deemed appropriate. She said she enjoyed being around me, but there was never any passion for her. It was painful, especially since it seemed like she was reading my thoughts. She just sat there and smirked. Carol said she couldn't believe that while we were in school, me in college and her in nursing training, I hadn't been with anyone else. I insisted that it was true, but she had evidence to prove me wrong. She started naming the men, the dates, and the places. It mostly lined up with the times when we had fights and briefly broke up. She made me feel like a fool. I admit that I was devastated, and while she was venting, I could tell that she was enjoying it. I suppose that finding out what kind of person she truly was hurt even more than the separation and divorce itself. However, I could sense that something more was going on with Carol that day in the lawyer's office. Her remarks seemed rehearsed and filled with guilt, not just about her affair with the doctor. I was too upset at the time to fully understand it, but Carol had her own demons. To think all those years, all we had done together, the sacrifices we made, and the dreams I thought we shared. None of it had meant anything to her. I had been a temporary fix, someone to use until she found something better. As I sat across the table from her, I felt nothing. She was like a stranger to me. I think she could see it in my eyes. The settlement, I was pleasantly surprised by the divorce settlement, at least initially. Carol wanted the house, and she got it. We had recently refinanced our mortgage and put a lot of money into it. Carol was quite pleased with herself for taking the house, something she had strategically planned before confessing everything. Carol had always handled the finances, so I never knew exactly how much she made. It turned out she earned slightly less than me. We split our savings, but since most of it had gone into the house, it didn't make much of a difference. She was fair with child support and didn't ask for alimony. However, there was a catch. I could have gone after her and Gilmore at their workplaces. It was quite tempting to jeopardize their jobs. While Gilmore would have faced some setbacks, he was skilled enough to quickly recover. On the other hand, Carol would have suffered greatly. In the end, I decided to let her keep her job and new partner. I just wanted to move on. She also agreed to be reasonable about the kids. She could have made it much harder for me to see them, but she didn't. I was able to get visitation rights every other weekend and one school night each week. She promised not to create any obstacles. I knew it would be tough initially as I needed to find a suitable place to stay, but I believed I could sort it out eventually. There was one more issue though, and it turned out to be significant. I had caused a lot of damage to the house during our fights, and Carol wanted compensation for her personal losses. I agreed since I was responsible for the physical damage. Lastly, we agreed to split the legal fees. Apart from personal belongings and our cars, we divided all other assets equally. Our conclusion, at the end of the meeting, I reached my hand across the table to Carol. However, she pulled her hand back, confused. It seemed like she had forgotten something, as if there were assets she missed. She asked, "Why are you thanking me?" I replied, "Carol, even if our marriage was a lie and everything I thought we had built together is now gone, I still want to thank you." She appeared surprised. I continued, "I want to thank you for the 20 happiest years of my life. I want to thank you for the dreams I thought we shared. Most importantly, I want to thank you for our incredible children." I paused and took a sip of water. My thoughts weren't focused on the kids and how we would always be connected through them. No, I realized that this might be the last time I ever saw her. I concluded, "I know our relationship is over and our lives together are finished, but I will always cherish the memories. Carol, I will always remember you. I once loved you, and I will remember the beautiful girl who made all my dreams come true." She started crying, and I had to leave. I walked away feeling broken. The woman I loved with all my heart turned out to be far from the perfect person I thought she was. All my illusions were shattered and things only got worse. I was able to see my kids, and Carol didn't intervene in that aspect. However, she began poisoning their minds with negativity. I had been reckless and destructive, so that was always there. Carol managed to twist every good memory into something bad. She filled their heads with half-truths and sometimes outright lies. At such a young age, it was easy for them to believe everything she said. It didn't take long before they started finding excuses to avoid seeing me. It was confusing. Carol was still angry, and I couldn't understand why since she got everything she wanted. I not only lost my wife and family, but I was also losing my kids. Thankfully, a few small miracles started to happen. Number one, I needed a decent place to live. I had no money to buy a new house, but my mom stood by my side throughout it all. My parents had always been frugal. Mom spoke to my siblings and managed to get them to understand and provide a little help. Together, we scraped together a small down payment, and I was able to purchase a 3-bedroom condominium on the second floor. It even had a hot tub and 1 bathroom. The complex also came with a gym and an outdoor pool. It wasn't a traditional house, but it was close enough. The kids might find excuses to avoid seeing me, but when they did come, it wouldn't be to some shabby apartment. Then came the second small miracle, thanks to Carol herself. Just a few months after our divorce, she got married to Dr. Gilmore. Good news? Absolutely. Good for me and the kids. Suddenly, Carol had a new life, and she became too busy to care for the kids. My children started to see a different side of their mother that none of us knew existed. They also discovered new options. They could spend more time with babysitters like Jenny McFertile, or they could choose to be with their dastardly father. They chose to spend more time with me and have regular visits to the high school. The kids were young, but they were not naive. Carol's indifference hurt them. I saw their pain and I was there to comfort them. Then Carol unknowingly gifted me with an even better, no, the greatest blessing. She became pregnant. I finally realized why she had avoided getting her tubes tied. She had always been looking ahead and planning for something better. Did I believe it? I wasn't entirely sure, but Dr. Gilmore wanted children of his own, and Carol was more than happy to oblige. Within 2 years of our divorce, I was seeing my kids more than Carol was. Since they moved to a new home and had to change schools, the custody arrangement flipped. Carol had them for alternate weekends and 1 day a week. I had my kids for all the other days. My life was changing, and it was changing for the better. There were other things that weren't so good. One was work. I was good, really good for a long time. No one knew what was happening. Oh, sure, they noticed on the rare occasions when Carol would have made an appearance that she was absent, but no one, well, almost no one knew the truth. Of course, it didn't hold up. I'd become a ghost at work. The truth about my failed marriage leaked out. What did I expect? My kids were with me at all the games. The students at my school were nosy. Yeah, mister, Wernicke's wife had left him for some doctor. It got like a Robert Louis Stevenson novel doctor. Jekyll disappeared and Mr. Hyde moved in, and with that came the commensurate loss of respect. Certainly another bad thing. One very bad thing was the question of my self-esteem. Carol had not only broken my heart, she'd successfully lied to me and withheld her true nature from me for nearly 20 years. I wondered if that was really true. It was hard to accept, but still I guess it was true, or I was just too blind, or just too stupid. I had to get even make up for my stupidity. Oh, I wasn't going to get even with Carol, that ship had sailed. But I had to prove something. I mean, was I a man, really a man? There was only one thing to do, and for those first 6 months or so I did it. I went to every tavern, every bar, and every night spot in the region. I found women, I dated them, I pursued them, and I left them. I flirted with every woman I encountered. I made a complete fool of myself. Oh, I had a lot of fun, and I never caught anything, but it didn't mean anything. The more I pursued, the more unhappy I became. For sure, I went to a lot of night spots that were visited by Carol's friends. I never planned it, it just happened. By then I'd changed my whole wardrobe and bought a new car. I was in the gym or at the pool all the time. I trimmed down and built up muscles. Sooner or later it had to happen. Some of Carol's nurse friends saw me out with a good-looking woman. They saw me doing things I'd seldom done with Carol, things like dancing and partying. Word got back to Carol. Oh, she never called. And I never saw her when I was out or anything. The kids brought me the news. Carol was furious. I wondered, why was she furious? Why should she even bring it up to the kids? I mean, what was her problem? Hadn't she won? Hadn't she gotten what she wanted? These were just more questions for which there were no answers. Part 2: Salvation comes with red hair and freckles. I guess I was killing myself, and I know it showed up at work. How did I know it showed up at work? I knew because it took another woman to reveal it to me. I had to admit I'd always noticed Ms. Fitzgerald. She had the look. She stood about 5'A", dark reddish-brown hair, freckles, skin like buttermilk, green eyes, and she behaved like the classic Dorothy right out of The Wizard of Oz. Well, she sure looked different from Carol. And I mean, almost everybody, including me, liked her. That everybody included the kids at school. Well, the kids didn't just like her. They loved her. They were crazy about her. Not everybody liked her, though. She had her detractors. I wondered sometimes if a few of the meaner teachers' dislike for her didn't have something to do with jealousy. Silly thought, of course it did. Me, I left her alone. She taught history, to me one of the most boring subjects in the curriculum, but she made it seem interesting. She supervised the school store, and she ran an after-school music program where she taught banjo to some of the worst slackers in the school. I remember how my first post-divorce interaction with Ms. Fitzgerald came about. I was at my desk in my office with the door open. I did that a lot. People generally were afraid of me, not afraid as in I'd hit them, but afraid because I was the principal and I could mess with schedules and such, not that I really ever would. There I was at my desk, feeling proud, powerful, and admittedly insecure when tiny little skinny Ms. Fitzgerald passed by my door. She looked in, and she must have seen or sensed something. She stopped, she turned, and she came in. Closing the door behind her, she walked toward my desk. I didn't realize it yet, but my life was about to change again. Ms. Fitzgerald came in, sat down, and started to talk. Brad, she said, I can see you're troubled. I want to help. What was that? I was her boss, her principal, and she used my first name. I replied, Miss Fitzgerald, emphasizing the Ms. I'm just fine. Now, is there anything I can do for you? She smiled at me. Then she started in on one of the more interesting conversations I'd ever had, Mr. Wernicke. Brad, she said, I'm almost 32 years old. I'm not one of the prettiest girls around, and I have the charm of a slug. I have a 5-year-old daughter with a deadbeat dad, but I know I can help. I thought, pretty good start. After all, I was basically a teacher, and getting the old whine and moan. You don't know how bad it's been for me at home has always been pretty standard from kids who wanted something. I tried to interrupt her, but she wouldn't let me. She was too busy throwing out ideas. She said, I can see. Brad, you're stuck. You're in a hole and don't know how to get out. Believe me, I've been there. I stood up, moved around from behind my desk, and started toward the door. Holding out my right arm as if to usher her out of the office, I said, see here, Ms. Fitzgerald. She wasn't about to stop. I should have known better. I'd seen her in action with her students. She was the original Energizer Bunny. She started to move into the arc of my outstretched arm, Mr. Wernicke. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone else is sorry, but I'm not. I've decided you need my help. I've seen your kids. They're a couple of adorable little munchkins and… Jesus. She was scaring me. I dropped my arm and took a step back. Undeterred, she continued to move in on me. I thought I saw a crack, though she unconsciously put the index finger of her right hand to her lips. I knew the sign. It was either a subtle romantic move or an unconscious sign of indecisiveness. Yeah, I got it, an obvious romantic signal or subliminal message of uncertainty. Either way, I was about to regain control. Before she could say another word, I interrupted, stood straight, and said, "Ms. Fitzgerald, your personal." I caught a whiff of her perfume, and she kept smiling. I tried to ignore it. Family history isn't. She was wearing one of her usual, sensible business suits, a gender-neutral heavy tweed suit. I tried to focus on her face. She kept fluttering her eyelashes. I awkwardly tried to finish my sentence. Important to me, except. This close. Not even the heavy tweed of that bulky coat could conceal her delicate and exquisitely feminine features. This was nerve-wracking. I might have to report her for this. I tried to finish, how they might. She put her tiny hand on my chest and gently pushed. Wow, I thought. She had such small hands, those delicate little wrists, and that clear nail polish. I leaned back against the front of my desk. With a quiet determination, I tried to reassert my position. Ms. Fitzgerald, this is. She placed her fingers over my lips. Not hers, mine. I thought, great Scott, such boldness, how audacious. I put my hands on her shoulders. Big mistake. Such tiny, soft shoulders. I was sweating under my sports coat. I knew I was blushing. I said, Ms. Fitzgerald, stop, please. She stopped. She took one small, very delicate step back. Starting tomorrow, she said, I'm putting you at the top of my list. You'll see. I want you to be my friend, my best friend. I mean to have you that way. She reached up and pretended to remove an imaginary piece of lint from the lapel of my sports coat. She beamed up at me. It was the sweetest, most adorable smile. Pearly white teeth peeked through beautiful lips. Then she stepped back. Uncertainty replaced confidence. Tomorrow, she said. At last, she turned and left my office. Wow, I thought, where did that come from? It took me several seconds to regain my composure, but I did. What had I just experienced? It was obvious it was one of three things. First, she sincerely believed she could become a friend. Second, but she was responding to some teacher bet, dare, or third, she was carefree, flirtatious, and she saw me as another conquest. I concluded it was either door number 2 or 3. I knew what I had to do. She had to leave. I had to get her out of my school. I walked around and sat back at my desk. Dr. DidSheReally, Mrs. Ariana DidSheReally was my supervisor. I picked up the phone. I'd call Ariana and arrange to have Ms. Fitzgerald transferred. She was just a history teacher. History teachers were easy to find. She'd be gone in less than a week. I called and got Mrs. DidSheReally's secretary. She informed me Dr. DidSheReally was out of the office, tending to a problem at another school. Darn, I thought. I had an idea where she was. They were having problems at Westwood High. She had hinted just a few days ago on the phone that changes were happening at Westwood. On the down low, she mentioned transfers were coming. Westwood was a mess. I knew their principal, and he was ineffective. Half of the staff there was ineffective. I thought about school system policy. All school systems did it. Principals, and I was one of them, never went all out to fire a teacher. It was just too difficult. There were so many variables: race, gender, age, seniority, unions, politicians, relatives, coaching jobs. We simply transferred them over and over. Eventually, these lemons, it was called the Dance of the Lemons, all ended up at the same school. At the time, Westwood was considered the lemon hole. Ariana had practically offered me the position. No way. Absolutely no way was I leaving Oakcrest, my school, for Westwood. If I talked to Ariana about Sheena, she might just as easily move me as she would move Sheena. I didn't want to go there, and I certainly couldn't let them send Sheena to a place like that either. The lazy wolves there would tear her apart. Moreover, if I managed to get Ms. Fitzgerald moved, I might end up with someone worse. I thanked Dr. DidSheReally's secretary and told her my call had been purely social. I would call again later. I told her not to even mention that I had called. Hanging up the phone, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had stupidly forgotten the foremost rule for public school teachers and administrators. Competent people were always expected to be able to handle their problems without asking for help. I'd have to handle my problem myself. The next day, Ms. Sheena Fitzgerald came into the school dressed in a pale green blouse and a stylish skirt. She caught the attention of everyone in the school, including me. Ms. Fitzgerald seemed to be seeking attention, just like other women I had come across. Throughout the day, I noticed her lingering around the main office, which was my usual spot. It was clear to me that she had an ulterior motive. At the end of the day, as I was about to leave, she approached me and asked for my help in carrying some boxes to her car. Reluctantly, I agreed to help. After we finished, she touched my cheek and mentioned that she wanted to meet with me on Friday afternoon after school at a nearby restaurant. She said she'd be waiting outside. I told her it was a mistake to think I would be there. I explained that it could jeopardize my job. She responded by saying that I would only lose my job if she complained, and she assured me that she would never do so. She believed I needed someone, and she thought she could provide support. I thought she was crazy, but she just smiled. That had happened on a Wednesday. The next 2 days at school, she tried to get my attention, but I avoided any direct contact. However, I couldn't deny that she was an attractive woman. As skinny as she was, she had a certain allure, unlike my ex-wife. On a cold Friday afternoon, I couldn't believe she was actually waiting outside the restaurant we had discussed. I decided to park my car and talk to her briefly before leaving. As I approached her, she waved and walked towards me. I realized my mistake. My car was parked on the other side of the front door of the restaurant. We would have to meet at the door to get her to her car. She reached me, took my arm, and guided me towards the door. She playfully called me a grand slam, knowing it was my favorite menu item at Denny's. I grumbled that I could only stay for a short time, perhaps just for a coffee. We sat at a table facing each other at Denny's. I warned her that it was just a one-time meeting and that I couldn't let her stand outside in the cold. She fluttered her eyes and said, "No, I know you wouldn't. You're a gentleman." With a shift in her seat, she continued, "I've had a crush on you since you came to Oak Crest. My husband left me and our daughter just weeks before you arrived. The divorce crushed me, not because of the money, but because of his hurtful words and actions. I saw you with your children, and you seemed so wonderful and happy. I'm sorry, but I could tell when your wife left you. I don't know what happened, but I understand the pain." She reached across the table and held my hand, saying, "Please let me help you." I appreciated her empathy, but I wanted to make it clear that I didn't see her in a romantic way. I told her, "Ms. Fitzgerald, I appreciate your interest and empathy, but I don't see you as a romantic partner." She laughed and said, "Thank goodness for that. No one has ever seen me that way, and it's for the best. I just want us to be friends. We already have a connection. I've been through something similar, and I believe I can help." It was clear that she didn't have any hidden intentions. She was being honest and open about her desire to be friends. I had my doubts about her true intentions, but I wanted to make it clear that any relationship between us would be strictly professional. I said, "I think we can be friends, but let's prioritize our roles as colleagues in a professional environment." She smiled and agreed, suggesting that we set up a play date where she could bring her daughter and I could bring my kids. We could talk and share our experiences. I noticed her beautiful features, long eyelashes, and the emerald earrings she wore. I felt a desire to brush away a strand of hair that was covering her eye, but I resisted. I agreed to the play date and asked her to pick a day and time. She thought for a moment and then suggested the following Saturday. I insisted that she make the decision, but she insisted that I take charge as the man. I felt a sense of pride and said, "All right, next Saturday. I'll let you know the details." We stood up, shook hands, and I walked her to her car. She drove away in her VW as I watched her leave. As soon as she drove off, I started having second thoughts. I checked the time and realized I needed to hurry home before my kids. Later that night, after putting my kids to bed, I made the mistake of looking through old pictures of my ex-wife and me. It was a sad reminder of what had been and what had ended. The emotions overwhelmed me, and I found myself crying. I knew I needed to end things with Ms. Fitzgerald before they went any further. The following Monday, I was on morning hall duty when Ms. Fitzgerald came in to collect her mail and homeroom roll book. My initial expression must have worried her because her cheerful face turned pale. I decided to act differently and walked towards her with a smile, loudly greeting her in front of teachers and students. I wanted to make it clear that we were spending time together as friends, not engaging in any scandalous affair. I suggested that we take our kids ice skating and have lunch at my place. Ms. Fitzgerald seemed unsure, but I reassured her. I reached out and touched her hand, exclaiming, "Perfect. I can teach you how to ice skate." Her smile returned, albeit with a hint of uncertainty. She replied, "All right, let's do it." As fate would have it, the first Monday of the month was typically reserved for faculty meetings, but I preferred using Tuesdays for such meetings. The next day, during a meeting in the cafeteria, I suddenly nodded towards a nearby table for Ms. Fitzgerald to sit. I wanted everyone to know about our friendship, not to hide anything. People would gossip anyway, so I wanted to be upfront and honest about it. The faculty meeting followed the usual pattern. They all stink. After the department heads and athletic director all went through their usual spiels, I called for questions or comments from the floor. This was my lousy time. I got the usual, "Why aren't we enforcing this or that rule? Shouldn't someone be in the cafeteria making the kids pick up all their trash? Why aren't you keeping kids from eating in the halls?" And the always heard, "I'm not attending any assemblies where there's going to be a prayer." I listened to the nonsense complaints, reminded everyone to listen to channel WKRP for any morning announcements about school closings or delayed openings, and then last gave them my regular reminder that we were all in the building to teach, and that we should all remember to do so. I felt like closing with a prayer, but knew anything like that would result in a call from Dr. DidSheReally. I thought about my school. I thought about some of my teachers. I thought about Ms. Fitzgerald. I thought about prayer in school. There were a few teachers I found easy not to like. There was a small group of teachers I privately called the rule enforcers. These were teachers who seemed to devote their lives catching kids breaking rules. The county had a system-wide rule about leather coats. Kids weren't supposed to wear leather coats to school. It was aimed at a few schools where theft was common. We never had that kind of problem, but there were a couple teachers who seemed to take delight in catching and punishing kids for their attire. One was a particularly strict older woman. She couldn't teach for anything, but she sure knew all the student rules. Once there was this little girl who'd been given a Swede coat for Christmas. Old Mrs. Strict caught her and dragged her downstairs to the main hallway where I was usually stationed. Old Mrs. Strict pointed to the little girl's coat and said, "Leather coat. What are you going to do about it?" Of course, this was nonsense. She just wanted to embarrass me in a crowded hall. The little girl was nearly in tears when she said, "Mr. Wernicke, my coat's Swede, not leather." I smiled kindly at the kid. I took the coat and said, "That's all right, sweetie." I frowned at old Mrs. Strict and growled, "You heard her, the coat's Swede." Old Mrs. Strict was furious. She stomped off angrily. Half-dozen kids saw the whole scene and were quietly laughing. I took the little girl to the main office where I quietly explained what Swede was. Later that afternoon, I was given a printout from old Mrs. Strict. The printout included a definition of Swede highlighted in yellow marker. Then there were assembly nuts. We had a few older ladies who insisted we begin every auditorium assembly with a prayer. I never had a problem with that. They always had to mention Jesus, but none of my other faith teachers ever once complained. Of course, there was assembly duty. A few teachers were always expected to be on hand to monitor the kids. I had two mean younger teachers who got angry for no reason. They threatened that if there was another assembly that started with a prayer, they'd refuse to do any more assembly duty. I kindly agreed. They were excused from assembly duty. I reassigned them to cafeteria duty, the absolute worst non-teaching job in any school. I privately laughed to myself, imagining them standing in the middle of the cafeteria while kids threw particles of food at them for 25 minutes. Why did I think of these unkind teachers? I thought of them because I knew most of them had a special dislike for Ms. Fitzgerald. Poor Sheena was always being called on the carpet by one or the other of the assistant principals. Sheena tried things. She arranged mock trials in her classroom. She planned and took kids on field trips. She, heaven forbid, even let the kids excuse themselves to the bathroom during class time. In other words, little Sheena Fitzgerald, being a creative, innovative teacher, was hated by the "it's not my job" crowd. Okay, so I was a timid pushover, but I guess I liked Ms. Fitzgerald. If I was careful, if I kept everything out in the open, no one would be able to complain, and I'd be able to have an out-of-school friend. It seemed like a manageable idea. Oh no, was I wrong? It was all downhill after that. We went ice skating. I hadn't been since before my divorce. Bridget had gone ice skating but never really learned. Brad Jr., however, was quite good. We ice skated. Bridget fell down. Sheena fell down. Sheena's little girl Laura fell down. I even fell down. It was fun. After skating, we went back to the condo and made homemade pizzas and watched a movie. We watched Disney's old thing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Even Brad Jr. enjoyed it. Like I said, it was all downhill. My kids fell in love with her. I was still having serious trust issues, but Sheena was proving to be the real deal. We started dating seriously. After our first real date, she insisted all our following dates include my kids and her Laura. That she was amazing. Sheena did everything she could to show that she genuinely cared. She didn't hide a thing. She told my kids right away she didn't want to be their mother, she only wanted to be my friend and help out where she could. I was hooked. I never believed it could ever happen again. I kept waiting for something bad to happen, but it didn't. My life kept getting better and better. I sat back and looked at the notes I'd jotted down for my son. I knew I needed to add something more. Who was Sheena? What had happened to her? What difficult things had she told me? What role did she play? And how did she become such an important part of everything we all did? There were some things young Brad knew, but I thought there were still things that he needed to hear that he didn't know. I remembered after my divorce how I'd suffered. I'd been lonely, bitter, hopeless, and I felt a profound sense of inferiority. I especially remembered the loneliness, how it ate away at me. That's something that can tear a person apart. I felt like I hadn't met expectations. I hadn't been good enough. I remember I constantly wondered where I had failed. Had I failed as provider, as a father, a lover? I just didn't know. Carol never said. I remember how desperately I needed answers. I needed closure, but it had never come. Somehow Sheena understood this. She seemed to know. We talked. It wasn't easy. She was a woman, and I'd gained a healthy mistrust of the opposite gender. In fact, after my decision to agree to her request for a date, I went back to my school's records and checked up on her background. I found out very little. She'd graduated from a fairly typical state college, much like I had. She was a little younger than me, and she had a young daughter. There was no mention of a husband, so I at first assumed she'd had her child out of wedlock, and the things she'd said about a divorce had been made up. A bad divorce can do that to a person. I did notice she'd changed her name. I had to admit it, I was paranoid. I had her address, so I'd drive by her apartment complex and watch. I wanted to see if she was dating anyone else. Was she just leading me on? Did she sneak out after work and go to some tavern? I found it was hard to take a chance and try to trust another person. It was just so hard. Our first dates were simple things. The most basic, we went to a Denny's or Texas Roadhouse, and usually a movie. Was I cheap? Yes, but I didn't know the woman. I only knew that I needed to gently find out as much as I could. Was I surprised? I found out so much I felt like I was reading a book. I guess I was, and it was a story I already knew. Sheena told me her story, and in the telling she set me free. Her story came out one night while our kids were asleep in their respective rooms, Brad Jr. in his, Laura sharing with Bridget. Let's get back to Sheena's story. Like me, she'd fallen in love with her high school sweetheart, but not like me, they had not used contraceptives. Sheena, in her junior year, found herself with child. Her boyfriend wanted to end the pregnancy, but Sheena held out. They got married, and both managed to work and still finish college. Sheena's uncle was a judge. He made a few calls, and she found herself at Oak Crest. Her husband became a car salesman. He sold Saabs. I'd heard rumors I doubted if they were true, but I'd heard only conceited jerks bought Saabs. I only bought Fords or Chevys, so it didn't really matter. Since he wore patterned socks, when it came time to do the laundry, she just threw that pair out. She said he got upset when he found out she hadn't washed his favorite pair of socks. Listening to Sheena, I realized, as bad as my divorce had been, hers had been even worse. I was never threatened or in fear of physical harm from Carol or her doctor. No one ever twisted my arm. I realized I was falling in love with Sheena, and it scared me. I was afraid of making another commitment. She saw right through me. She told me some of the things her husband said to her. He told her how he thought she was clingy, she was suffocating him, and that he needed time for himself, time to be free. Near the end, she said he alternated between mean and sad. He told her he was already seeing someone else, someone better in bed, someone who appreciated him, and that this new and better someone had money. Then he would get sad and guilty. He'd cry and whimper that she was too good for him, that he needed someone who wasn't so pure, and someone not afraid to get dirty. At the very end, she said her husband admitted everything he'd had multiple close relationships. He'd been with several other women. He told her he did it because it was exciting, it was always an adventure, and he knew he could get away with it. He said she was boring, and he just couldn't see himself living with her the rest of his life. I listened, and I realized Sheena's husband had said many of the things Carol had said or tried to say to me. I thought, it must be part of the common excuse the unfaithful use to justify their actions. Yes, Carol and Sheena's husband had been hurtful, cruel people. But they both got one thing right: neither was the right match for the person they betrayed. I realized while listening to Sheena's story why Carol needed to break up with me. It wasn't about jobs or money, or power or prestige. It was because Carol always knew I was the better person. I was better than Carol. She was the one who failed, not me. I convinced Sheena to move her and her daughter in with me and my family. Then after a few weeks, Sheena and I sat our kids down at the table one night and had a serious talk. They were much more mature than us. Shortly afterward, Sheena and I got married. Our families and some of our teacher friends attended the wedding. I loved her. I really loved her. Finally, I had found happiness again. I had closure. I believe she had too. Of course, my feelings for Carol had changed. I no longer hated her. I felt sorry for her. It seemed that while my life was getting better, Carol's was not. Carol already had one child by Dr. Gilmore, but she had separated from him. It seemed she had found someone even better. She had filed for divorce so she could start openly dating a heart surgeon. I didn't know what to think. We had dated for almost 6 years and been married 12 before she left me. She had only been with Gilmore for a little more than 3. I was convinced there was more to the story. I thought Carol was sick. Did Carol get her divorce? Did she get her heart surgeon? Yes, she did, and the last I heard she was supposedly happily married. But with Carol, one never really knows. I knew one thing. Once I thought I had all I ever wanted, only to see it turn to nothing. Now I realized I had been given a second chance, and I was absolutely making the most of it. Epilogue: Carol's story had ended long ago for me, but whenever Brad Jr. stopped by, he always had something to say about his mom. He was worried about her. He said every time he stopped in to see her, all she talked about was me and her and our long-dead marriage. He said she seemed to be living too much in the past. She did say once she was a little bit sorry she left me. I was sorry too. Then, I just kind of felt sorry for Carol now. I think she's searching for something she'll never find. She came to Brad Jr.'s wedding, but she didn't bring anybody. I thought she had the heart surgeon she could have brought him. She looked as lovely as ever. I danced with her once at the reception, and we still had a good time. I still remembered her perfume. We talked and laughed about some old things. About halfway through the dance, I realized Carol was reminiscing. I got a little embarrassed and felt self-conscious. I glanced over at Sheena. She was smiling. She saw it too. I thought, that's my girl. I was a little surprised Carol mentioned Vernon Smithers. I'm not at all sure, but I think I heard the guy had his own auto shop. I wonder, maybe Carol's mom and dad should never have broken them up. I thought maybe Carol had found what she was looking for at 16 and had it taken away. That was kind of sad in a way. Back to the real world, not long after Sheena and I married, we had to buy something bigger than the condo. There are 8 of us now, including Junior and his wife. Let's see, there's Bridget and Laura, of course. Since then, Sheena and I added 2 more. There's Sean, who is 10 now, and then there's Eileen, she's only 7. Sheena gave up teaching. She's gained a little weight lately. Makes her look softer, even prettier if that's possible. She says she likes staying home, says she likes to cook and take care of the kids. She's still a regular fixture at Oakcrest. She teaches banjo and does some SAT tutoring on the side. I'm good with all that. I'll say this: Sheena can have or do anything she wants. And that's a fact. I see Brad Jr. just pulled in the driveway. He's only been married a couple years. I hope I'm ready with what he needs to hear. I hope things work out with him and his wife. She's a nice girl. If things don't well, we'll be here for him. That's what parents do. One last thing, am I happy? Now that's a silly question. The end.